So thank you all for joining. Like I said, I am really excited to welcome David Hogg tonight. David was thrust into the world of activism by the largest school shooting in American history. A Parkland survivor, he has become one of the most compelling voices of his generation. Alongside his classmates and fellow survivors, David co-founded March for Our Lives, one of the world's preeminent youth-led movements. His call to get over politics and get something done challenges Americans to stand up, speak out, and work to elect morally just leaders. In 2023, David and Kevin Latta, who was Maxwell Frost's 2022 campaign manager, and if you don't know Maxwell Frost, look him up and follow him. First Gen Z candidate, actually congressman, joined forces to found Leaders We Deserve, and they are dedicated to recruiting, training, and funding young progressives running for Congress and state legislatures across the country. They currently support over a dozen Gen Z and younger millennial candidates working to transform the future of the Democratic Party. And if you don't know, congratulations, because David was just elected as vice chair, the first Gen Z vice chair of the DNC. So David, I'm going to kick it over to you, and then we will be back for some questions.
Thank you to the Julies for hosting this and for having me. Thank you to everybody for being on here in this moment. I know it's a hard moment that we're in, obviously. But it really hardens me to know that there are 350 plus of you that are currently on here, still engaged, still doing the work, because it's going to take all of us to do it in the first place. And I'm struck in this moment because I'm reminded of where the country was politically when Parkland happened. We had a Republican trifecta in Washington in 2018. There were Republicans in the House, Senate, and presidency. And after the shooting, we were told that it wouldn't be possible for us to create change. We were told repeatedly that what happened to us as young people was terrible, but this is Florida, that things don't change here, that certainly nothing's going to change in Florida, and definitely nothing's going to change in Washington. And basically, people told us we were crazy for even thinking that change was possible. And maybe we were to some extent, but because we had the audacity to believe that it was, we kept pushing for it. We didn't listen to the people that told us that we couldn't talk about the NRA. We didn't listen to the people that told us that we couldn't talk about banning assault weapons, that we couldn't speak so overtly about the necessity to address this issue in our state because we were too red of a state to do that in, or it was too unpopular to talk about the NRA, or the NRA was too powerful. And because we did the exact opposite of what we were told to, which, as many of you who have teenagers know, we were very good at as teenagers, we ended up proving all those people wrong. We mobilized with thousands of families, parents, and especially our young people around the state of Florida to show up at our state capitol to demand action on gun violence. In collaboration with our teachers, with my fellow classmates and others, we proved all the naysayers wrong. We ended up raising the age to buy a gun to 21, and we passed a red flag law that, since the shooting in Parkland, has been used over 19,000 times to disarm people that are a risk to themselves and others. Mind you, we did that in a Republican trifecta state. The reason we were able to do that, though, is because we went on the offense and we got Republicans on the defense there. We got them because we were pushing so hard for these things, and we showed up and we weren't afraid to say it. And we were boldly saying it to them and not letting this debate be had on their terms, not letting them define, oh, you can't talk about this or you can't talk about that. Because we went out there and said that, and we helped to register, tons of students to vote around the country, we ended up raising that age and passing that red flag law. And I know the impact of this. There's many people who say to me, David, gun laws are important, but the reality is criminals don't obey gun laws. But the reality is we have laws for a reason, and it's because they work. After Parkland, my family got thousands of death threats, both online and even through the mail. And in one instance, somebody sent a death threat to my own mother that said, F with the NRA and you'll be DOA. And we were able to use the law that we passed after Parkland to help disarm the man that threatened to kill my mother. That is the impact that these laws can have. And as we changed those laws, we decided that we wanted to do more. So we looked to the civil rights movement for inspiration. And we decided to have a march in Washington. And we thought we were going to get about 90 people to Washington, D.C. to protest with us. And we ended up having over 800,000 people march with us in Washington, D.C. We had marches all over the country, from everywhere from Boston to Lincoln, Nebraska to Los Angeles and everywhere in between. We helped create the largest student protest in American history, not because we had a massive bureaucracy, not because we had focus groups and polling and message testing and all this stuff, but because we were real human beings that said what we were thinking and gave people a message that they could believe in, to be part of that change, to vote with their own 2 feet and march with us. We registered tens of thousands of young people to vote because we heard repeatedly, it's great that you kids care about this, but you don't vote. So we did. We registered tens of thousands of young people to vote as part of that. And following that march, we decided, we also had a bunch of walkouts around the country that were further inspired by the civil rights movement. Probably 1 million plus students, I would say, around the country walked out to demand action on gun violence from all their schools. Even as I would come to find out several years later from a researcher friend of mine, even some homeschools walked out to protest gun violence. And we ended up having this massive youth movement, the likes of which we'd never seen since the Vietnam War. And we decided, what can we do with this power now? And we decided to go around the country, taking further inspiration from the civil rights movement, and did a bus tour around the country, where we talked in districts where if young people turned out to vote, where they historically hadn't, but they had walked out of their schools and they had protested with us, if we could turn them out to vote, we could defeat NRA-backed incumbents. And that is exactly what we did. We spent 63 days on the road, going to dozens of states around the country, and we ended up defeating more NRA-backed incumbents than ever before in American history because of that, ever, as a group of young people that were told that we didn't know what we were talking about. And that was in part because of our incredible movement that we have that includes Moms Demand Action, and the people that helped us do those marches in the first place. It was also because of the years of work that have been done, in particular by Black and brown women that have been at the center of the gun violence prevention movement, that laid the groundwork for it, and have never got the attention that they deserve or the credit that they are due. People like Erica Ford, including also people like Pastor Michael McBride and so many others out there. And because we did that, and we had this massive movement, we were able to get the largest youth voter turnout in a non-presidential midterm in American history, with young people voting disproportionately Democratic. That is how we flipped a lot of those seats. But eventually, I had to go to school because I needed to go to college. And while I was there, I was taking a full immersion Spanish class, and I was in the middle of, we were trying to hire somebody to help take on a lot of the work that I was doing and some of my other classmates were doing at March for Our Lives. One of the young people who helped us organize some of these marches was named Maxwell Frost. Maxwell, I said, we needed an organizing director. So I called Maxwell up and asked him if he would apply to be our organizing director. And originally he turned me down. But then the next day I flunked a Spanish test because I'm dyslexic and it was full immersion. And I called Maxwell and I said, you don't understand. I have to pass this class to be able to graduate from college. I need you to take this job. He ended up agreeing to take the job. And 2 years later, Maxwell called me and he said, David, I have good news and bad news. The good news is the bad news is I'm leaving March for Our Lives. But the good news is I'm running for Congress. And I said, Maxwell, you're 24 years old, right? He said, yes, I know. I'll be old enough by the time I'm elected. And I had never really helped somebody run for office before at this point because I didn't really feel like any of them properly represented me in terms of my age and understanding the anxiety of what it's like to go through a school shooter drill, at least as a young person. Obviously, our teachers have to go through that, but it's still different when you're a student. And Maxwell's my first opportunity to do that. I ended up having to help him raise over $400,000 in his first 2 quarters. And as I was doing that, as I was in college, I was also having meetings with the White House to talk about creating something called the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. This office is very important because the purpose of it was to help coordinate the federal government's response to gun violence. Because we've allocated hundreds of millions of dollars to help combat gun violence, but there's never been a central point within the federal government to help make sure that all of that money is being properly used and allocated by states who can get it. They just need to simply apply for it a lot of the time. And I was repeatedly turned down and told that the office wasn't needed, that we didn't need to do it. And as Maxwell was running, I was having those meetings. Eventually, he ended up getting elected, becoming the youngest member of Congress in a super competitive primary. And the first bill that he introduced was to create the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which helped us put more pressure on the White House. And within a year of Maxwell being elected, I found myself, before I even had graduated college, I found myself witnessing Congressman Maxwell Frost introduce the President of the United States for the announcement of the creation of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And I just found out recently, after talking to the now former directors of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, that in the year 2023, when we created that office, we saw the single largest reduction ever in American history in gun violence of gun homicides in particular of 12% reduction. That is obviously nowhere near enough, but that is a major step forward. And this year, or the previous year in 2024, we've seen the preliminary data are still coming in, but we believe that after my conversations with them, that there's been about a 14 to 15% reduction in gun homicides on top of that 12%. So we're talking nearly a 30% reduction in gun homicides around the country. And folks, I know that is nowhere near enough, but I have to tell you, that's a hell of a lot better than where we were headed previously under the presidency of Donald Trump. Unfortunately, that office has now been abolished by the Trump administration. And thankfully, part of what we did to shore up the possibility of that happening was we've helped to create offices of gun violence prevention in many states around the country to help do that same purpose of coordinating the state's response to gun violence. But I say that to say, I know things feel really hard right now. It is incredibly horrifying, to say the least, to see what is happening to our most vulnerable communities, to see people that are not able to get their children medication because of Trump around with Medicaid, to people that are not able to get their kids into Head Start programs or may not potentially be able to continue those programs because of them doing that, to the thousands of Afghan refugees that were turned away after already being cleared to come into our country, after sacrificing and risking so much to help protect our troops, to then be turned away the day that Donald Trump came into office. It is incredibly hard to be hopeful right now, but I'm not asking for you to be hopeful. I'm asking for you to just keep trying.
Okay. You kind of already touched on this, but I'm just going to start with it anyways. There are a lot of people in this country and people that I know, people in my family, who tell me constantly, there's too many guns out there. It's a lost cause. We really can't do anything about this. You've already touched on some of the things we can do. I guess, what do you say to those naysayers or to those people who are just like, it's too big a problem. We can't address it?
That we are addressing it and we have had an impact on it. I mean, cutting gun violence by nearly a third in 2 years is nothing to sneeze at. And we're doing it in a bipartisan way. One thing I forgot to mention, because I have a tendency, there's so much to talk about, I have a tendency of just going on and on, was we passed the first federal gun law in 30 years after Uvalde and the Buffalo shootings. That was done in a bipartisan way. And it didn't ban the purchase of guns for people under the age of 21. Because currently and this is going to be a bit outrage inducing to you all, but part of the reason why the shooter at my high school a major reason why he was able to get an AR-15, which is the weapon that he used to commit the shooting, was because he wasn't able to buy a handgun from a federally licensed dealer. Under current federal law, from a federally licensed dealer, you were not allowed to purchase a handgun if you were under the age of 21. But you can purchase a semi-automatic rifle like the AR-15 so long as you're above 18, because that makes sense, right? And by the way, that challenge or that law is currently being contested in court right now as well, because the NRA and others want to lower the age to purchase all guns and not keep it at 21, which is absurd. And yeah, what I would say to them is like, we are making progress. You're not going to hear about the shooting that doesn't happen, right? But what I would talk about is looking at some of the reports of when red flag laws have been used out here in California, where I am currently, or in other states, and say like, look, you can look it up, like red flag law saves lives in such and such state, if there is one. And there's thousands of instances of people that were serious risks to themselves and others that very likely has saved lives that we just won't know about because we're not going to hear about the shooting that doesn't happen. So that's part of what I would say. And then also realizing that I would love to have everybody in this fight. We need as many people as possible. But ultimately, we need to focus on moving the people that are the most likely to work with us, because the majority of this country agrees with us, right? All we need to do is make that majority a little bit louder to make this change. And that's just what we've been doing. And part of the reason we've been able to make so much progress on this.
Thank you. That's a great answer. So I know people on this call, people across the country, are very worried about MAGA's control at the federal level right now. Can you explain, though, why gun violence prevention is not limited just to what the federal government is doing? And what role do state governments play in this? Because I think there's a lot of impact people can make at their state and local level.
Look, it plays a massive role getting involved at that state level. That's why 95% of the money that we spent last year with Leaders We Deserve was on state legislative candidates. If you want to get involved in making change, it's going to come from the states first and the local level before it ever comes from Congress. And that's part of how we passed several hundred state gun laws around the country since Parkland. My advice to get involved in that is, joining groups like Moms Demand Action, for example. And also there's state level gun safety groups that you can also join. You can look into groups like Newtown Action Alliance as well. Either one of those are great entry points for people to get involved in the movement to save lives and advocate for stronger gun laws around the country. I'm just thinking. Yeah, there's so many ways that I could think of people to get involved, but those are the two best ones because the other ones are more local and they're very specific to different communities around the country. But one thing that Ceasefire Pennsylvania is also very good to get involved in. There's a group in Delaware that you can work with too if you're there. There's all kinds of them, all kinds of state-specific groups around the country. Part of the challenge we have, though, is frankly, we can strengthen gun laws all we want in a lot of these states. It doesn't change the fact that they're going to come from across state lines until we have stronger federal laws in ways at cracking down on that. What I will say as a point of like hope to go back, because that's a really important question that you asked me earlier, and this comes back to the state question too, is if every state had the same gun death rate as Massachusetts, arguably the state with the strongest gun laws in the country, if every state had the same gun death rate as Massachusetts, we would be able to cut gun deaths by 70% in this country. Those laws have been ruled constitutional and they've been proven effective. We do not need to reinvent the wheel here. This is not rocket science. Every other country has solved this issue. And it's not by putting metal detectors in schools. It's not by arming teachers or arming students or creating doors that open only one way. It's because in other countries, they have people who have the intent to want to kill a lot of people, but few other countries give them the capability in the way that we do to commit that atrocity. Because in order for an atrocity to occur, you need the intent to harm a lot of people and the capability. We are a unique country in that we give the individuals with that intent uniquely easy access to that capability.
You had an interesting point you just made about crossing state lines. And one thing I hear a lot from people who don't agree with me on this are, oh, well, some of those blue states have these really great laws, but there's still a lot of crime. And, what I've always heard, and I would love for you to hear your opinion on this, is that because so much crosses state lines, you've got the state with no gun control next to the state that's got strict gun control. What kind of impact does that have?
Let me just look up a statistic really quick from the director of gun violence prevention that he sent me the other day. A lot of major cities saw massive, like even 40, sometimes I think one of them, I could be wrong on this, so don't quote me exactly on it, but if I'm understanding this correctly, according to the director of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention that I was texting with the other day, I think Boston saw an 80% reduction in gun homicides over the past like 3 or 4 years. And I think last year it was 24 people that were killed. That's obviously still far too high, but that is a hell of a lot better than what we've seen. And your question was specifically around how do we answer to those people? Like, what do we do about the gun laws? The thing is, when we talk to people who don't agree with us, as you can imagine, I am somebody who is well versed in this because both voluntarily and involuntarily, I have many conservative family members that I have had to talk to about this. And also, when I was I've been counter protested by people armed with AR-15s, screaming that my classmates and I were crisis actors, that were here to take everybody's guns. And I've had conversations with them since I was 18 years old. And even in college, I ended up joining the shooting club because I didn't want to just surround myself with people who thought like me constantly. I wanted to talk to the people who most disagreed with me to figure out how we can make progress here. And the way that I would encourage you to have conversations with people who don't agree with you on this or may not agree that like gun laws are the way to go about it, or that some of these blue states with stronger gun laws still have a lot of gun violence. One, there's a lot of people that live in our blue states, and naturally there's going to be more gun violence per cap, like naturally, because there's just going to be more people and they're going to hear more about it if it's a major city. But two, my story and how to handle this goes back to when I was in the shooting club. and in a competition, actually. We were in a competition against Northeastern, Yale, MIT, the Coast Guard Academy, the Naval Academy, and West Point. We lost horribly, thank God. But in the middle of this competition, the coach came over to me and said, what's your name? And mind you, he was 6'3", like a walking refrigerator, former Olympic skeet shooter, big guy. And I'm standing there and I have a 12-gauge shotgun cracked over my shoulder. And I say, David, when he asks what my name is. And he says, David, what? And he's holding up my Wikipedia page on his phone. And I say, David Hogg. And he said, what are you doing here? You're here to like take my guns? You're here to protest me? Like, what are you doing here? And I said, look, I'm here because I think you might have some assumptions about me that are not entirely accurate. And I may have some about you that are not entirely accurate. Now, as part of those assumptions, I would also assume that you don't want school shootings or gun violence to continue either, obviously. So while I understand that you may not agree with banning a gun like the AR-15, and you feel very strongly about that, you probably do agree that we need more mental health funding for the 2/3 of gun deaths in this country that are suicides, right? He's like, yeah, well, of course. And I said, well, great. Now we could try to debate this and go nowhere, or you could help me become a better shot. What do you want to do? And then I went and nailed all the clay pigeons because my dad was an FBI agent. And obviously that is a very unique situation that has a lot of guns involved literally in that moment. So it's kind of high stakes. But the reason why I bring it up is so much of the disagreement on this issue, in my view, in the hundreds, if not thousands of conversations I've had with people who vehemently disagree with me, who, oftentimes will start out as a Twitter message saying something awful to me. When you take somebody who has that level of disdain and hatred for you, the reason they have that hatred and that disdain more often than not is because they are expecting it to be reciprocated towards them, right? They're expecting me to respond and say, you're a piece of shit, that you're all these, expletives and everything like that, and like you're terrible in all these ways. But when I respond to them, what I say is, look, I can respect that you don't agree with me, but I can't accept the fact that you don't want school shootings or gun violence to continue either. So is there anything that I could say to you that could change your mind? Any amount of statistics or stories or anything like that? And when they say no, I say, well, great. I'm not going to waste my breath trying to debate you on this because you're not open to have your mind changed. So how about instead we talk about what we can agree on? And then I'll talk about, for example, the shooter at my high school. And I'll say this to him. I'll say, look, the shooter at my high school owned an AR-15 legally as a 19-year-old, and he repeatedly threatened to shoot up my high school. He was reported to law enforcement multiple times and the FBI multiple times. Do you think somebody in your local community that threatens to shoot up a high school should have access to that AR-15 and be able to continue to legally own it? And they almost always say, no, of course not. And then I explained to them, well, that's why we created red flag laws in Florida, to disarm people that, for example, threaten to shoot up a high school or kill their neighbor or something like that. And they're like, well, that makes sense. I say, well, exactly. Then you agree with me. And every single, even if they don't agree with that, every single conversation that I have with them, if they continue talking to me, they apologize because they realize that the hatred that they felt is not reciprocated and they feel like an asshole. And that is the most goddamn gratifying feeling in the world. Far more than me saying to them, you're a terrible person, and making me feel like I'm on my high horse morally and that I'm somehow superior, because they're expecting a level of disdain and disrespect and hatred towards them. And when that is not reciprocated, it breaks down the in-group and out-group mentality that has divided us on this issue for so long, and it makes them second guess themselves. And even though in most of those first conversations I have, people don't immediately change their mind, it opens up the opportunity for them to do so later. And even if we aren't fully ever changing those people's minds, if we can get them to fight us less hard because they see us as human beings and not crazy liberals that are here to judge them and hate them and say you're a terrible person, as much as we might feel like we are right, I have seen it myself where people come back to me that have literally called me a crisis actor and say, David, I'm sorry for calling you that. I was wrong. And I agree with you now. And I know it's hard for us to hold the emotional, especially for me, as you can imagine, with how personal this issue is for me. I have had to actively decide, do I want to live in a comfortable delusion where I don't make any change and just surround myself with people who agree with me? Or do I want to actively choose to live in an uncomfortable reality where change actually might be possible and we might be able to make these school shootings history, not headlines anymore? And that would be what I would encourage everybody on this call to do. understand you're not going to change everybody's mind. We don't have to. But if we can get people to fight us less hard and we can kind of contain our self-righteousness in to some extent, as hard as that might be, but ask them questions and give them the opportunity to change their mind, nobody is ever going to come to our side where we're calling them an asshole or we're screaming at them. As much as we might be right, by the way, in saying that. We have to choose in this way. This is not about, going high. Like when they go low, we go high. This is about when they go low, we get smart.
Yes. Well, thank you. You actually just we teach constantly about finding common ground with people no matter what the issue is, and that's how you have those conversations. And so thank you, because you just, gave a perfect example of why we tell people to do that, to find that common ground no matter what the issue is you're trying to talk to somebody about. You mentioned red flag laws, and I really want to make sure people on this call understand what all of what that terminology means. So can you explain some of the ways we actually could address gun violence through legislation? One of them being red flag law. Like, what is a red flag law? You kind of explained that a little bit, but maybe give some more detail on what those laws do.
I mean, a red flag law is basically a restraining order to remove somebody from their firearms if they are deemed to be a danger to themselves or others. Um, it's really not that complicated because right now, a lot of the time in our states, if somebody threatens to shoot up a high school, for example, in Texas, where they currently, at least to the best of my knowledge, don't have a red flag law still, based off of conversations I just had a few months ago. If somebody threatens to shoot up a high school there, the best you can really do is essentially kind of Baker Act them to some extent. I don't know if that's the right terminology because this goes more into the field of like laws around like mental health and things like that. But there is no way to legally remove the firearms from that individual. That is what these laws do. They say to the police, like, all right, this person is known to be a danger to themselves or others. We're going to remove their firearms. That is how a red flag law works. And guess what? Republican sheriffs are the ones who use it most in Florida, just so you know. And that's part of the reason why Ron DeSantis, despite winning by 19 points and having a supermajority, he can do whatever the hell he wants. And they've done things like, permitless carry, which is obviously not great, but they still haven't lowered the age to 20 to buy a gun. They still haven't repealed the gun laws because the law enforcement agencies are very supportive of that because they know that they fucking work. Pardon my French. It's just the truth.
I live in Ohio, permitless carry. We have it here, and law enforcement did try to fight that, and they still passed it. But yeah, I know what you're talking about.
The other stuff that we can do too, though, part of the reason, part of what we need to talk about in these conversations, the people who disagree with us, is that there are a lot of places that the vast majority of us do agree that we are not making progress on. And I don't just mean around gun laws. Like, we know most people agree with that. I mean, like, even the people who are most ardently against us agree with some of these things. We cannot just focus on how does somebody, the lens that we have to look at how we address gun violence cannot just be how does somebody get a gun and why do they choose to pull the trigger. We have to address both. And right now, there's this false dichotomy that has been set up where conservatives are typically the ones talking about mental health and mass shootings, which is problematic in a number of ways, to be clear, because most people that are mentally ill are far more likely to be a risk to themselves than others. 2/3 of gun deaths, roughly, it's getting closer to 50%, but 2/3 historically of gun deaths in this country are suicides that happen predominantly in rural and suburban areas with older to middle-aged white men. That is the demographic that dies most from firearms in this country in terms of gun suicides. We need to make sure when we're advocating for these things, even if we're in a red state, there are programs that we can fund to help reduce gun violence that stop a shooting before they happen. And let me explain what I mean by that. The biggest predictor typically of who ends up shooting somebody else in this country is whether or not they have been shot, that person, whether somebody has been shot before or somebody they know has been shot before. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? It's retaliation. One of the things that the gun violence prevention movement has done, and we've actually seen some movement even in Republican states on, is funding programs that go into hospitals with members from the communities most impacted by gun violence to talk about when there is a victim of gun violence that comes in, that there is somebody there to console their family and reduce the retaliation that is going to come with that, most likely, and stop it from spreading. And programs like that have proved to be some of the most effective in our country at reducing gun violence. And they don't even have to do with gun laws. So when you're talking with somebody about ending gun violence, realize it's laws are probably, in my opinion, obviously the most effective way of addressing it because that's how every other country has done it. But we're also in a unique situation as a country where we have very divided government, uh, many Republican states, and we have 400 plus million guns in this country. We have to make sure that even if we can't address how somebody is getting a gun by addressing the laws, in the meantime, we are addressing how do we stop somebody from wanting to pick up a gun and use it on somebody else in the first place. And that means addressing the underlying drivers of most daily gun violence in this country, which a lot of the time is joblessness, it's hopelessness, it's so many different compounding factors that drive somebody to pick up a gun in the first place. And there are programs that we can fund called violence intervention programs that can help reduce those instances of gun violence without even touching gun laws. And in our more Republican states, those are areas that we have seen progress on that we need to keep pushing. And we got to break out of this false dichotomy because we can't just address how somebody gets a gun in the first place. As one final note on that point too, the biggest predictor of where gun violence occurs in the United States is actually where communities were redlined by the federal government throughout the 1930s and 40s. And those lasting effects of economic injustice have lasted through this day. And that's part of the reason why we have to invest in programs that get people that have experienced gun violence into therapy, because there's millions of young people in this country that have very significant PTSD from walking over bloodstained sidewalks, from hearing gunshots in their neighborhood growing up and to this day, and also witnessing instances of gun violence often themselves. This is a cycle of trauma that is driving gun violence. And if we fund programs to break that cycle of trauma, we can both save money for our government by preventing shootings before they happen and help to protect law enforcement's lives by making it so that there are less shootings to begin with. Because by the time a police officer is responding to a mass shooting or an instance of daily gun violence, we have already failed. Somebody has probably already died or is going to die as a result of that. And we're expecting our first responders to be on the front lines of addressing this issue, which they always will be. We're always going to need somebody to respond to gun violence, but we can't expect them to do that when our damn politicians are not willing to do their part and simply pass better policies at preventing shootings before they happen.
But it is good. It is good for everyone to understand that there are intervention techniques and things that aren't relying on legislation. Like there are groups that fund this, that do this. So there's people that you can support and get involved with, like to help, like you said, to prevent it before it even happens. So I think another thing that people misconstrue, and I always hear people say, I say we need universal background checks. We need gun checks on every gun sale, and people are like, we already have that. Can you explain the reality of what we actually have in this country?
Sure, right now you're allowed to it's not that complicated. You're able to sell a uh I mean it depends on the state, to be honest with you, but under federal law, you're able to sell a gun in between two private sellers without a background check. And the main argument that comes up against this a lot of the time is, well, what if I want to sell a gun? What if I want to give my gun to my relative? My question is, this is a famous line that Marco Rubio brought up. My question is, I don't know who the hell your relative is, and they should need a background check. That's part of why we push for universal background checks, to make sure that if you want to get a gun in this country, regardless of how you're doing it, that you need to have a check and a system to go through the background check process if you want to own that firearm in the first place.
So I'm positive we have a lot of parents on this call, a lot of teachers probably on this call. What do you say, or how would you advise them to talk to kids, who are fearful? They go, like you mentioned, they go through active shooter drills in school. What advice do you have for them about talking to kids about this issue?
Um, I mean, sorry, it's just it's so up that we even have to have this conversation in the first place. Like it
Right.
um to me it's a little bit like talking about like how do we explain to young people during the Cold War why they're going through a nuclear bomb drill, right? We can tell them how to hide under their desks in different orientations and all we want. It doesn't change the fact that that is a weapon of mass destruction. And we're living through a similar moment right now as a country, except the difference is the bomb is going off multiple times a year. And to be honest with you, I don't have the perfect answer on how to talk to them, because it is impossible to talk to people, especially young people, about things that that shouldn't be happening, that frankly are a product of the failures of our politicians, of our elected officials, and our government to do its fucking job and protect these kids. And again, I'm sorry for cursing. It's just, this is so wrong that we're here. I think the best thing that you can do is explain what you were doing to take part in helping to prevent these from happening and making sure that they're involved in that process and they understand like what you were doing to support them. And letting them know it's okay that you don't feel okay when these shooter drills are happening. But this is a incredibly hard thing to answer because there is no perfect answer that I'm going to give you where your kids are going to feel good or teachers are going to feel good. My mom's a teacher, right? She had to go through a drill just the other day, and it's extremely traumatizing to her, as you can imagine, because her own kids went through this when my sister and I were 14 and I was 17. And I think the best answer is to try to turn that fear into advocacy, because what they want is us to sit down, shut up, and continue to put our teachers, who already, by the way, are severely underpaid, who are already expected to be social workers, who are already expected to be parents half the time, who are already expected to be nurses and therapists and so many other things, to also be police officers, because our damn politicians will not do their job in protecting our kids. And what I'm trying to do is, in the same vein that President Biden's generation went through those nuclear bomb drills, they went on to pass the largest arms reduction treaties in human history. There's a reason we don't go through those drills anymore. And I think part of that is because they so uniquely felt the anxiety of what it's like to be told by your government the best thing it can do to protect you from a weapon of mass destruction is how to hide under your desk better. What it is incumbent on us to do as Democrats, in my view, and as a movement in general, is to bring that generation into power, to build an intergenerational coalition, to acknowledge that it is okay that they don't feel okay, to acknowledge the mental health effects that come with those drills, but make sure that we don't lead our young people into believing that this is just how things are. This is how they've always been, because that is when we're really in danger, is when they start to accept that this is just the way that things are in the first place. We have to wake up our country from that and make sure our young people are galvanized to make sure that we are the last generation to ever have to deal with this.
Yes, I agree with that as a mom, and I like what you're saying about obviously if you're an elementary school kid, it's gonna be harder than if you're a teenager. But taking action, I think no matter what, always makes you feel better, you know, that you're not just sitting there being despondent. And I also say listen to your kids, make sure you're there to support them and address their fears. I mean, I got involved in gun violence prevention because my kids came home from high school and were telling me that they had a first day of school and they were checking for their escape routes. I went to school in the 80s, guys. I never had escape routes from school, and I was astounded when they said that. So just listening to that was enough to motivate me too to get really involved. So it's definitely listening. Um, so David, I know we're going to probably have a lot of questions. Julia, I'm assuming that's true. So we'll probably take a little break here and start doing that. But is there anything that you want to say before we get to Q&A? Anything else? You've covered a lot of ground, so.
Um, we're gonna win this thing. We will. Like if history. So in college, I studied history, and if studying history for 4 years taught me anything, it's that great generations are not born; they're made in the crucible of awful circumstances. And our generation, I think it's important for people that are not Gen Z on this call. I I think it's important for you all to know that my generation has never seen our country united, ever. Ever. The last time that I think you could say that was even temporarily was after 9/11. And what defines Gen Z is whether or not you remember 9/11. If you don't remember 9/11, you are part of Gen Z, or you're Gen Alpha or Beta, whatever the hell we're on now. I'm getting so old. We, as a generation, we have to empower them to be the change that they want to see.
Okay, Julia, I'm turning it over to you for questions.
All right. Well, you kind of answered one because there was a recurring theme about you running for office and what can folks do to help you, and they can't wait to see you run for president. So just letting you know you have
Maybe one of our candidates one day.
You do have a base of support here if you ever change your mind. And you talked a little bit about what our generations, because there are, several generations here. I'm Gen Z, I mean, sorry, Gen X, and we've got boomers on here. We've got, everybody's on here. So they want to know, what can we do to help Gen Z help you get this moving? You said money obviously is one way that we can help, signing up for the email list, but what else can we do?
Join groups like Moms Demand Action, join your state gun violence prevention groups as well. Also participate in your local Democratic parties. I know that may not be the most sexy or exciting thing to hear about, but there's a lot of work that we need to do in the party, and that's going to be one of the best ways that you can do it. And we need as many people as we can to help build a better party here. I'm trying to think of what else. Just more than anything, make sure that your kids vote. Even if there's nothing else that you take from this call, make sure they vote in every single election, and you vote in every single election, and do the best job that you can do the best that you can at your most important job if you're a parent on this call, which is being a parent. A lot of the people that are up this world right now are here in part because they were not raised right. And the more intent that we can put into raising a better generation, we reflect what our parents put into us, right? And the love that was put into us. And every single day I carry that. I come from a family of public servants that sacrificed so much every single day to get me to where I am. And it is not a responsibility that I carry lightly. And it is something I'm grateful for every day. And it's, I think about the fact that my dad was not only a Navy helicopter pilot, but a teacher and an FBI agent. And I think about the fact that my mom is still a teacher. She teaches in a Title I school, predominantly to kids that are learning English for the first time that recently immigrated to America, that are on the front lines of the border crisis. And the work that we have to do to build a better country so that we build a more fair and equitable country, so that when things go awry here, we don't fall into the trap that is as old as time, to look at people that do not look like us, or do not speak the same language as us, or do not love like us, or do not pray to the same God as us, and say that person's the enemy, and instead work collectively together for the benefit of all of us at the same time. Because it really sickens me. There's a lot of disgusting stuff Trump does. It really sickens me when he says that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. When the kids that, walk with their parents to America from Venezuela and don't even speak English, that sacrifice everything to come here and get here, in my opinion, that person's more American than me. Because they know, even though they don't speak our language, they don't speak English, they know the universal language of a dream and what America can mean to them. And we have to build in future generations, the education, and for our country, just the ability to love other human beings enough so that we don't turn on other people when things go wrong. And instead we fix the political system that it up in the first. So basically, do the best that you can to be the best parent that you can. Second to that, make sure your kids vote.
So one of the things that you talked about was, making sure that young people vote, your kids vote. So how do you motivate young people to vote? Because that was a question that was recurring in here. And it also has been a theme, even over the last year when we were doing other programming. Folks were like, well, I can't get my son or my daughter to get interested. So how do we get young people involved?
One, you have to frame it, in my view, as try to get their friends to talk to them about it instead of you, if you can. That would be one. And then two, I would also figure out what they care about and talk about like what these different positions are and how people are impacted by that. And also like speak to them like an adult, like a human being, right? Like don't speak down to them and say like, this is your civic duty and all that. That is not going to motivate them. They do not care about that. You have to show, in our view, what we did with March for Our Lives, one of the smartest things I think that we did was that we mobilized our generation by framing voting and civic engagement as a rebellious act. They do not want you to vote. They want to stay in power so they can continue to send their bullshit thoughts and prayers and do nothing about gun violence. They want you to think that your vote doesn't matter so that they can stay in power and this crisis continues. And it is incumbent on you to help rebel against that and fight against that by voting them out of power. That is how I would say that you motivate them, but it's different for everybody. But regardless, talking to their friends and getting them to also talk to them about the issues that matter is a really good way of doing that, but also showing yourself, like, why do you care about this? How does this actually impact human beings that, you know, whether it's the local level, the national level, whatever it is, and talk to them about how their lives, even if they don't feel it, are touched by the political system. So, yeah.
So do you have any plans to delete and or defeat the NRA?
Well, we're well on our way. We filed with the help of some great tax lawyers. We've started to take them down like Al Capone, because they were spending their 501c3 charitable donations on things like, you know, private jets, Armani suits, so on and so forth. And in the time since us sending that letter to the incredible Attorney General of New York, Tish James, shout out to her. She's a total badass and huge advocate and ally to the movement for gun safety. And one more example of how Black women are the core of the gun violence prevention movement, because she single-handedly, massively up the NRA, and it was incredible. They've lost over 1 million members since since March for Our Lives started, and the movement to end gun violence has gained over 1 million members. The NRA increasingly stands for not being relevant anymore. Because of our audacity and how ferocious we were as young people, and the moms have been, and so many people of all generations have been, and boldly led out there and said, no, like, you're going to pass this gun law. No, we're going to hold you accountable. We have seen our movement grow substantially, but it has to keep growing more and more. But we just need to make, like I said, the majority just a little bit louder in order to be successful. There was a question that I saw about suing gun companies. So there was a law that prevents that called the Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, otherwise known as PLACA. We have to repeal that law. People often say to me, David, why don't you just hold gun companies accountable the same way as big tobacco and sue them? Because big tobacco wasn't smart enough to pass a federal law that prevents you from being able to sue them. That is how they're able to be taken down. We need to repeal that law. It's part of the reason why, and I'm speaking as David Hogg in my own personal capacity here, not as a DNC vice chair. I believe that we need to abolish the filibuster, and I've been very outspoken about that in order to pass this life-saving legislation. And yeah, that's why we're not able to sue those gun companies.
Yeah, there are more regulations on a teddy bear than on a firearm. I've been in gun violence prevention since 1999. So yeah. What can folks do to help other communities? Say things are okay in their community, but they need to help somebody, you know, adjacent. How can they, what are some things that folks can do to help other places near them?
I mean, if there's other communities that are more impacted by gun violence than yours and you want to help them, I will tell you first and foremost, do not go to them and say, this is what I'm going to do to save you. Do not do that. It is extremely offensive to do that and wrong. You need to approach the communities that are, first of all, you need to understand people have been working on preventing gun violence in these communities for decades, because gun violence prevention activism, like all activism in its truest form, is not voluntary. It is a form of survival. You have to approach communities, if they don't look like your own, if they are impacted by gun violence and you want to help them, with an extreme amount of humility. And you can email one of the organizations on the ground there and say, like, what can I do to help you? Like, and sometimes that might look like nothing. Sometimes that might look like just hosting a fundraiser to support them. Like a really good friend of mine is Erica Ford in New York, who has led this work since she just retired, but she did this work for 20 plus years in Jamaica, Queens, in New York, leading one of those violence intervention programs. The way that I have always approached working with her is I've said to Erica Ford, I don't know outside of Parkland how gun violence affects other communities at all. And it would be wrong of me to assume like I know how to solve gun violence in Jamaica, Queens, and New York, but I do know how to give it. What can I do for you? If you want me to move chair, like sometimes that might look like me literally just giving her access to my Twitter and saying like, here you go. Here's 1 point whatever million people on Twitter and Instagram that you can talk to directly about what's going on there. And I will just hand the mic over to you because you've done this work for so many years. But it's humbly asking, what can I do to help you? And listening to them when they tell you, and not saying like, oh, actually, I don't think you know how you want me to help you. I'm going to do it this other. Don't do that.
Please don't.
Ask them how you can help them, and actually actively listen. And sometimes understand that might be not doing anything at all. You can find other ways to work on gun violence, but approach it with an extreme amount of humility, and whatever it is that they are asking for, just do it. Even if it's the smallest thing, even if it's moving a chair, even if it's, getting them water, basically being an intern for them, whatever it is, just ask how you can help, and don't be an asshole, and approach it with an enormous amount of humility.
I love that. Thank you. Let's see what else we got here. Oh, somebody asked about gun violence in toxic movies. And what do we do about that? That's an interesting question, because I'm not for censorship in any of its forms. So, that's kind of a tough one. I don't believe that movies are the things that are necessarily motivating anyone to do any one thing or another either. I think that that's just something that describes what we already have going on out here myself. What do you think?
Yeah, I understand why people bring this stuff up a lot of the time, but the reality is, violence is so pervasive in our culture as is. That's going to be a much bigger thing in general, that we have to address. What I'm focused on, what I will tell you, will have much more of an impact than, let's say in an optimal situation. This is not what I'm advocating for, by the way. I grew up watching James Bond and playing Call of Duty. Clearly, I'm not going to go out and perpetrate an instance of violence, but as have millions of other young people. Even in a best case scenario where we're able to remove all references to guns or guns in general from all movies and media, we're still going to see this stuff out there, because there's still going to be shootings that are happening, and there's 400 million guns that are still in our country. And what I am focused on more than anything is, how do we limit access to only the most responsible people to have access to those firearms in the first place? And I don't want us getting bogged down and just focused on the media side of things, when I think that this issue needs to be centered on how does somebody get access to the gun more than anything. Why they pull the trigger is also very important, but we're so severely under-resourced that we have to be very strategic in what we are focused on. And for me, that focus is on addressing not just, just addressing how does somebody get access to an AR-15?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, with that, looks like we are a couple minutes past time. I'm going to kick it back to Julie. Thank you so much, David. This was very, very informative.
Yes, thank you so much for all you have done and all you are going to do. You keep stepping up for leadership, and we really appreciate that. And for those of you who have been asking in the chat too about like how to get involved, want answers to those questions, this is something you care about and you want to start a group that focus on it. I saw Sherry, our Pennsylvania program director, dropping this too. We have Trouble Nation. We help you start grassroots groups. We support you, so you can focus on your state legislature or your local city council, whatever it may be. If this is something you're passionate about, we'd love to help you get that started near you. So thank you so much, David. Thank you to everybody who came tonight. We appreciate you all being here, and we hope you have a really good rest of your evening. You want to say
one more thing I just wanted to say. I know we're over, but this is probably one of the most important. Don't forget to have fun. This work fucking sucks. It is awful. If you are only around each other when there's something awful that has happened, whether it's an instance of gun violence or an abortion ban or something like that, you are going to come to hate each other, because the system is not meant to be changed, and you're going to turn on each other because you think each other are the problem, even if you aren't. You can do one of the hardest lessons to learn in this work is that you can do everything right and still fail. You can. You have to understand that joy is part of the resistance, because if you come to associate each other with just when we fail or when it's incredibly hard work, you will come to hate each other. Make sure that you hang out with your friends that are in politics outside of the political context too. Have a meal with them, have a wine with them, whatever it is, and do it regularly, because this is extremely hard and grueling work, and it will take years to fix. but we have to sustain ourselves as we're doing it and not see joy as antithetical to the resistance, but an essential part of it. So make sure that you were, as dark as things are, that you're having fun with each other while you're doing it too.
All right, well, David uplifted the red, red, and blue themes of the night, which is find common ground with people to have those hard conversations. And yes, you have to have fun. You have to be social. You have to have joy in it. That's why we're red wine and blue. Wine is the metaphor for the social aspect of organizing, the joy, the friends, the fun. So, David, thank you literally for reinforcing everything we've been teaching for years now. And thank you all for attending again. And we hope to see you soon at another event. Have a good evening.
Yep.